Hello, data people. I'm your host, Sean Busquila, and this is the Leading with Data podcast, where I interview the humans who are leading with data. This podcast has no sponsors, no product promotions, and no paid participants. Just straightforward thought leadership and real data talk. In this week's episode, we're discussing how to drive data literacy in an organization. Welcome everybody to the Data Leadership Podcast. I have a really special guest today that some of you will know as the Bowtie Data Guy. His name is Louise DiModugno. I am very excited to welcome you to the show here. Thank you for joining. Welcome, and thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Absolutely. So, Louis, you and I met at CDAO. We got chatting about lots of different topics. And for those who don't know you, just giving a little bit of your background, you've spent the better part of the last 30 years in data leadership and starting from the military and going into kind of some of the corporate world. You've worked at PwC, AXA, HSB, some really great companies. And what really intrigued me from our conversations is how focused you've been on delivering value of data and getting people excited within the organizations, in particular business people, around data. And I really want to explore a lot of that with you, as well as our main topic today, which is around data literacy. But what I'd really like to start with accomplished leaders like yourself is getting a bit of background of how you got here. So can you share with us, what got you to data and what still keeps you really excited around the leading with data?
Sure. I have to say I was very fortunate in where I showed up at my first duty station in the Air Force. Desktop computers were also showing up at the same time. And since I was the youngest and had the most current information about the technology, I was put in charge of deploying these desktops throughout the base, specifically in the aircraft maintenance space of the organization. And so I very early on got associated with the technology side of data, but my job specifically in the Air Force was really focused on aircraft maintenance. And with that, a lot of predictive analysis of really understanding when does the aircraft need to be serviced, what kinds of things can we be predictive about engine usage and repair and refurbishment. And so it really got me intrigued very early in my career around the capabilities of using data and statistics and really understanding what the opportunity is and having that information and being able to add value to what you're doing day in and day out. So that's really where it started on the side of the equation. That ran for 27 years, and I retired as a colonel running the largest jet engine repair facility in the country. And again, it was really focused around understanding the data of how do you build a process to bring engines, in the front door that are broken or are timed out and refurbishing them to having a fully viable product at the back end. I was fortunate while I was active duty to be recruited with General Electric with their Six Sigma initiative. And so I was part of the first cadre in the financial services space to work in Six Sigma and utilizing that methodology in GE. And GE was really kind enough to recruit me into the financial side of their organization. Having come from the industrial side of the military, it was quite a challenge for me to move over. But again, their insight was process is process. And whether it's on the industrial side or whether it's in financial services, it's really about understanding the steps and what changes from step to step and being able to use data to understand how that process is managed and standardized and monitored.
Say the transition between military data operations to the corporate side of things is probably a topic that we can spend a ton of time on alone. But yeah, it's great to hear this experience. Please, go on. I'd love to hear kind of what keeps you kind of excited about it today. What are the things that through all of this time still keeps you excited around data?
The thing with GE and with the Six Sigma, I moved from black belt to master black belt, and the master black belt side of the equation was much more heavily statistics oriented and you needed data in order to be able to perform those statistics. And so I endeared myself to the IT organization and really got into the nuts and bolts of what made the technology work, how were these data warehouses assembled, where was the data coming from, how could you encourage data quality and really understand these data glossaries and dictionaries of where is the data, what can I trust, how can I bring it together, and then how can I use it for good for the organization. And it's really what kind of set me down this path. The opportunity from installing a Six Sigma initiative at a major insurer and then moving on from that into consulting really gave me the opportunity to understand the need for these chief data officer roles and building out these organizations to support them.
Great. And I completely hear the excitement and the opportunity around that. From the background that you and I spoke about, you've really consistently highlighted this idea, like I mentioned at the intro, of driving value to the business and making sure that the business recognizes their ability to extract value from the data. And one of the concepts that you mentioned to me was this idea of driving a culture of curiosity. I'm really interested to understand from your perspective how that comes to fruition. What does it mean to you? And maybe some of the steps that you took in order to start kind of driving that concept of culture of curiosity, which I really...
It's an interesting area that, again, I kind of take it from the idea of my military background. You know, one of the Defense Department leaders while I was in the military was Donald Rumsfeld. He has a famous quote out there of, you know, we don't know what we don't know. And so you get into these area of unknown unknowns and different versions of that, whether it's known knowns or some variant of unknown knowns or known unknowns. And in each one of those cases, the question is, what do you know? And what do you really have a confidence in knowing? So do you have the data to back it up? And then the other area is, what questions aren't we even asking? Right? What questions should we be asking? What data do we have to be able to answer those questions? And if we do know the question, do we have the reliable data to help support deriving an answer for it? That was another area that GE was very interesting in, is that they would take a practical problem, turning it into a statistical problem, come up with a statistical solution, and then convert that back to a practical solution. And so it's that idea of, you know, how do I go ahead and understand the issue, use math to solve it, and then translate that back to how can I practically apply it? That's really the challenge with a lot of this in this data space, is that now we're at a point where we have so much data available to us. The question is what do we refine, you know, or where do we emphasize our quality initiatives around it? Because we hopefully are addressing specific strategic elements of the business and utilizing that data or aligning that data strategy to go ahead and focus on the business strategy that would support it, and using that math to help support these business strategy solutions. And over time, you can see in specific industries, there's areas of definite opportunity. So like in the insurance space or the reinsurance space, being able to really understand the claims or the output of what's happening in an insurance environment and trying to either drive down or approach claims from a different mannerisms to ensure that there's good customer service associated with those claims, because it's definitely a very significant emotional, impactful element of the insurance service. But having that capability of being able to use that data to address those service needs or to address those, you know, driving down the claims either through predictive or prescriptive capabilities, all this data is available now. The question is how do you apply it, or what answers are you looking for? And again, it really comes back to this idea of where do you spend that money? Where do you spend that investment? And how do you ensure that the pockets that you're spending on are truly addressing the business problems that are out there?
And when it comes to the culture of curiosity in particular, it sounds like one of the things that you're looking to drive is to make sure that executives have a good enough understanding of the data that is available, a good enough understanding of what questions they're already asking and getting answers for, and then what questions could they be asking, but also be able to ask them in a way that everybody understands. The people on the data side can take the requests or the questions that the business asks, even if they've never been asked before, and actually move that into data, into analytics that they can deliver back into the business. Is that an accurate summary, the impact of culture of curiosity?
Yeah, and again, to emphasize what I think you just said, or your summary of what I just said, this idea of culture of curiosity is about not being afraid to ask the questions, right? Being able to really go that next step and ensure that what it is that you are dealing with, you have good knowledge and you have good faith that this is truly an answer that I can rely upon because the data I have I can rely upon. But then that curiosity component becomes this aspect of, what questions aren't we asking? Or what questions do we need to know the answer to that could help us run this business even more profitably or more effectively for our customers? That's really what it drives down to. And then again, it's this curiosity aspect of really trying to drive an idea or a culture around not being afraid to ask these questions and not being afraid to find the answers, to understand the answers either. Because I think that a lot of us have good hypotheses around how we believe things are working, how processes are working, how, our customers are interacting with us. But to truly know, that that's really the answer and that you've got good data to back it up, that's another level of understanding. And to get to that level of understanding and to have a foundation to build upon, then you've got that capability of saying, all right, I know this. Now, what about this? Or, can we fill in this gap? And it's that curiosity aspect of being able to articulate those questions, but then also interpret them to the data scientists. Because sometimes your data scientists are just so focused on dealing with the unknown unknowns. They're out there really kind of scratching the edge of the atmosphere of trying to utilize their statistical capabilities and the data that they've got just to kind of experiment. But to really get into areas that are going to impact the business and the business strategy and the business focus, you've got to have that translation or that connection between the business and the data scientists so that they understand truly what is the question we're trying to solve.
Well, I heard a few words repeating from you during your explanation on the culture of curiosity, which were understanding, translation layer, being able to ask the questions, and then being not afraid to ask the question. And it seems like a lot of that would be enabled by having a shared language and good understanding between the two. So data literacy, for the sake of creating some sort of a good foundation for our conversation here, what does data literacy mean to you in the concept of you've just spoken about and within the organizations that you've worked with?
Well, I think one of the main areas that need to be focused on in the data literacy space is just having a common language. And so, trying to speak to a data scientist about what they're using Python or R programming languages for is a very big challenge for a business person, right? And again, the business person may not know all the capabilities that a data scientist has at their disposal based on all the new technologies or the new families of statistical analysis that have come out recently over the last 10 or so years, or at least I don't know that there's really been that much new statistics development that's come out. I think there's been a new desire to utilize some of these tools and to apply them into these areas. This statistics has been statistics for many years, and the challenge is that it's become a little bit easier to get into the hands of people that maybe weren't as comfortable with it before. And so we see, development of a lot of this no code, low code capability that's out there as well. But it's the literacy aspect of really trying to understand things like, well, how much lift does this model give me based on not doing anything? Or, what's the level of confidence that I have in this model from a predictive nature going forward. And so there's all the statistical jargon that needs to be understood. But then there's the data itself that really needs to be understood. And so having a very strong data glossary or a data dictionary gives you that opportunity to be able to share an environment with the business and with the data engineers and data scientists, so that we're all dealing with the same level of understanding of, hey, here's a data element that I have a really high confidence level with on the quality side. Here's a data element that maybe is not as, I'm not as confident of, but maybe it's something that I really have a good hypothesis around contributing to the lift associated with a predictive model. And so just being able to talk about data at the element level to really understand, even the metadata, what are we calling this data? Where was it captured from? What was the source? How old is it? Is it the freshest data that we have? All the information about the data itself, that metadata layer is very important as well. And I think the people on the business side haven't had a real good exposure to what that metadata is and what it is doing for us, and that what we could be utilizing it for to really understand, how fresh some of this stuff is, what the quality nature of it is, where it's coming from. Do we trust that source? Are we purchasing that source? Is there a level of expectation associated with that source because, we're paying X amount of dollars for it? Or maybe we're getting it for free because we're scraping it off the web. There's all these different sources, all these different ways. And again, this goes back to the literacy of the business understanding, where did the data come from? What's been done to the data? Is there an opportunity to apply it to different types of models or different types of potential solutions? And when it comes out, what is my confidence level of that output? And so it's all those levels of steps through the data pathways to really understand that, and to have that common knowledge, that common literacy that really helps the business to know better around what it is that they can rely upon there.
That's great. Data literacy is there to bring the data people and the business people a little bit closer together in terms of mainly the business being able to ask the questions in an educated way. So when business executives want to explore a new area, back to your culture of curiosity, they're able to be accurate about the questions that they ask, whether it's the source, whether it's the specific traits of the data that they're going to use. I know that when business executives are able to ask the questions in a more educated way, in a way that shows that they are literate in data, it also really helps the people on the data side to deliver the right things. And then they in turn also take a lot of interest in the business impact of the data that they deliver. Data literacy really does have such a massive impact on the overall culture and the overall effectiveness of the business or the organization that people are working in. I'm curious, for those who are today in a company that they're not quite sure what step of data literacy they're in, or perhaps even somebody potentially starting a new role, what are some ways for people to assess the quality of the data literacy that they have in the organization? What are some of those symptoms that you can talk about?
The challenges that you can come up against, or that I've seen, in the data literacy space, is really about, bringing an organization to a level of understanding of what is capable. And that's part of the challenge, is that organizations have been, in existence and profitable. Some of these corporations have been around over 100 years. They've gained profitability. And so the questions they have is, why change, right? Or if I do have to change, let me change at my own rate. Let me go ahead and do what I think internally is the next step of the growth of the organization. And I think that what's being missed right now is there are so many new types of companies that are digital based right from the foundation. And having that digital knowledge, having that digital birth of a new company. That's where I see opportunities for some of these older companies that are not using their data or are struggling to bring their data together. They're going to get left behind because these digitally based companies that are collecting data at every aspect of every interaction with their customers, that really understand their customers and understand how their products are being used, that's where it really comes together from a digital standpoint. And to be able to continually pivot and move into new markets, into new products very fast, and not have to worry about, pulling together all of this legacy architecture and trying to dig to find the data that they need to make the next level decision. That's really where I'm starting to see some of these aspects for some of these legacy type companies. They don't have the ability to move as fast to the market with new ideas because they aren't leveraging or can't leverage the data that they have within their organization, or to bring their data together within their organization to see, customer development through product interaction, through customer moving on to new products or cross-selling, or really trying to leverage some of the other aspects of the company. There are all these things that potentially can be driven together through these customers using more and more of your services, more and more of your products. But if you don't have that capability of seeing how they're using it, either from a behavioral compilation or really trying to understand, again, the modeling aspect of how they're using the products, those things really are at the fingertips of these digital companies and allows them to move faster.
I want to clarify. So one of the symptoms that you're speaking about here is reluctance in terms of change, or maybe being change averse, could be related to a lack of deep understanding of the data that is available. And likewise, modern companies today who are at their base very digitalized are taking a huge amount of advantage of that nature that they are, and they are more data literate. So you can see the contrast between newer companies who are more digitalized, they're more data literate, to some of the more legacy companies or traditional companies that are still going through a bit of a fear of change. And that could be tied back to data literacy. Is that kind of a good example there?
And again, I think that a lot of legacy type companies too, they have architectural silos of data, right? And so they potentially don't see the opportunity for the data to come together across those silos. And again, this goes back to this idea of the literacy or the knowledge base of understanding what's available, and what can we do with it? And, can we answer this question, or can we even ask this question? All these things, from a literacy standpoint, and back to the curiosity standpoint of knowing what you can and can't do with what you've got, that's a big piece of this. And like I said, with the data scientists come in, they come in with new ideas around how they can manipulate the data. But I think it really has to always go back to the business side of the equation for them to really understand, what is it that I need to know in order to get the best out of this next level product or new product? What is it that I need to know about my customers and how they're using my products, or what gaps are there in the products that we need to fill? These are the things that, again, once we know them, we can go ahead and move on those opportunities. But it's the literacy standpoint of that business understanding, what can I do with the data? What data is available that I can rely upon? And how can I convey that to my data partners in the engineering and scientist space to really make sure that I've got good transparency, good understanding, and are utilizing that in a proactive way?
It sounds from what you're saying here, and I can very much relate to the idea that when you have good data literacy, people understand what questions they can ask, but the impact at the end of that is that they make better decisions, that data is a very strong parameter in their decision-making process. If you have a meeting with some business leaders, can you, through your understanding of how they make decisions, have also make an assessment on how data literate the organization overall is? And are there any examples or any areas that you would listen for in a conversation when it comes to executives making decisions?
First thing I would ask is, do they have a data catalog? Do they understand what data is available? Maybe even what are you using data for today? And they may have some good dashboards, there may be some visualizations. They may have a small BI organization on the business side that's helping to generate some of that information. Oh, I can rely on this. I get this report every day. I have some level of understanding, or I have some belief that this data is good. And that's another area that could be probed on the business side, is, a discussion with the business as to what data can you rely on versus what data are you suspect. This goes against maybe their hypothesis of how the business is running, their gut feeling of this is what I think is going on, or this is what I believe is going on. Well, do you have data to support that? Right. And again, these are the areas where when you start talking about literacy and what they know, so these are the known knowns, right? This is an area that you can really focus on with the business to really understand what is it that they know, what is their belief in the data today.
If you were sitting in front of executives and you said, how do you approach a decision on how much to invest, let's say, in marketing of every single one of the products that you have? And if the answer is, well, Terry from marketing told me that that product is awesome, so we're putting some more money into that, that sounds like there's probably a bit of work to do from a data literacy perspective. Whereas the other one is, well, we've looked at the data, we've looked at these few dashboards. We know that we have a fairly high confidence in this particular area of the data, and this other area of the data might require a bit more experimentation. That to me sounds like data literacy is at a pretty high level at that point, if executives are speaking in those terms. You mentioned here a few times something that begs a question here around the expectation of data leaders to have a good understanding of data, of how data works. Now, I recently saw a post by somebody that I thought was really good, and they said, don't expect business people to be data people. They have a day job. Literacy isn't about, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, if you think I'm wrong here, but data literacy isn't about taking a chief marketing officer and making them into a data engineer or a data analyst. They need to have enough information in order to ask the right questions. And here's a question that I think is a very interesting one, and it might have a very intuitive answer, but I think that the next level of that question is where I find it very interesting. And so I'll start with this. Which function, which role is responsible for driving data literacy within the organization? So maybe let's start there, and then I'll unpack a little bit more of that.
I've had the very good fortune in my last two roles to build out a chief data organization from scratch. And so in both those cases, I would strongly say it was the chief data office that was responsible for the literacy initiative to bridge the gap between data. And what I will bring up is the challenge of where does not only your data office reside, but understanding the different goals of the business versus the data or the IT organization, the data management side of the house. And what I would say is your business is always going to be focused on profitability and customer service, right? It's the customer service piece that really is the piece that keeps you in business, right? If you don't have customers, you don't have a business.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's the effectiveness of how well are you meeting your customers' expectations and delivering value to them, whether they stay your customer or whether you're able to grow your business. So it's the effectiveness, which is on the business side and which they are focused on in order to continue to achieve their success on the business. But on the IT side of the house, right, it's really focused on the efficiencies, right? Is how well can I deliver a process or deliver an outcome for the smallest amount of investment? And so it's that balance of efficiency on the IT side versus the effectiveness on the business side, which quite frankly can be very much opposing forces when you go ahead and you pit them against each other. And so it's this data office role that resides between the two that has to balance the how can I go ahead and help the business through data value and really help them understand the outcomes on the questions that they're asking, and do it with the best technology, but the best investment as well associated with that. And it's that balance that, again, I see the data office really helps to reside there. The other challenge too, and I'll bring this up in our conversation here, is where your data office resides is another whole discussion that we could spend time on, right? Whether
Yeah.
your data office is on the business side or your data office is on the IT side. And I've seen large corporations have the organizational structure both ways. I'm a big advocate of having it on the business side, again, because I think that what we're trying to do is really trying to use data for the business right, to help enable the business strategy so that they're meeting their goals and that we're hitting our customer successes appropriately. Where versus, the times that I've seen the data organization aligned with IT, now all of a sudden the data organization is much more sensitive and focused on customer data privacy and data security and these things that are more preventative measures of the data not being able to be as prolific or as utilized on the business side as possible.
Your point around where the chief data office sits, I'm hearing more and more consensus around that really being on the business side, and that makes a lot of sense. I do want to touch on one really important point from what you mentioned there. One area that I think is a little perhaps controversial, or people aren't fully in agreement on how this should be done, is the expectations that data leaders have from business leaders. I do often get the feeling that data leaders have an expectation that the business leaders just understand it. They just want them to understand it. And what I'm hearing from you, which I think is very encouraging and very accurate, is that there is a role for the data leaders to provide not just education, not just, look, here's a guidebook on data, read it and come back to me and then be data literate, but they need to be very, very precise and very intentional with what that education entails. How deep do business executives need to go into that? And to also appreciate the fact that it is the role of data leaders to be the educators of the business executives. And I think that part is sometimes missed. I want to take it to something very practical here for a minute. If you were sitting today in a conversation, in a meeting, you had a CFO, a CEO, and a COO in a meeting, and you came in and said, hey, I'm Louis. I'm here to drive more data literacy within the organization. And they said, great, how can we help? And which is what you want to hear from them. How can they help? What are some of the practical things that you would ask from them, either in general for them sitting on the business executive or independently based on their roles? What would you ask them of them?
Well, I think all initiatives of this size and nature have to start at the top. And so the CEO needs to be involved from a advocacy standpoint and from a sponsorship standpoint to really be at the forefront to say how important this is for him, for the organization, and that as far as a vision is concerned, we are going to be data driven going forward in the organization. And in order to do that, we all need to be able to speak a similar language and start to utilize data more in everything that we do, right? So again, from marketing to presentations with the customers to the finance organization, just really having a much better understanding of how the needles are moving and how much the needles are moving. Where were we? Where are we going? Where are we now? All these kinds of potential visualizations for an organization to see that this initiative is making an impact. And so having the CEO periodically get up there and say, hey, these are the things that we're measuring going forward, or this is how we're using data going forward, and then periodically showing the organization how that's impacting some of the core metrics of the company. I think that that's very, very important. That's probably preeminent in all the other efforts going forward. They all need to be led from the top. The CFO, I would be looking for investment, right? So from a finance standpoint, there needs to be some improvement in the capabilities of the organization. And that doesn't mean just technology either. That could be in an education effort, right? So you could bring in maybe a specialized organization to help educate the company to really understand what are some of the capabilities associated with this going forward. And then on the operations side, it's all about the how, right? And so this gets into the process and potentially what new technologies you can implement and how do you go ahead and roll those out into the organization so that people know. On the operational side, I'd like to emphasize that there's the long-term initiative. Hey, this is how we're changing the company so that we are all, going to be new and different 2, 4, 6 years down the road. But there also needs to be a tactical initiative so that people can see things are changing around them in a monthly fashion, as opposed to having to wait for that 2, 4, 6 year initiative to culminate. They need to see things change, and they need to see opportunities and capabilities improve as this is happening. And so, again, there needs to be a good communication initiative to really make sure that everybody understands how we're getting to that new world order.
That's awesome. And I want to summarize here really quickly to make sure that I got it from you. But CEO, lead by example, show not just that there is an initiative and a willingness to use data to make decisions, but also show the company some examples of data that the company has observed and decisions that it's made based on that data. CFO, demonstrate investment. So show actual dollar, investment in the data space. And I think that is, both of those already are so critical.
And the one thing I'd add to that too, Sean, is that not only is it important to show that we're making an investment, but it's also incrementally important to show that we're getting value out of that investment. And so there needs to be a good measurement system put into place so that people can understand the incremental value that's being created.
I think a big challenge that a lot of CDOs that have is the lack of investment that they get. There are these wild expectations from data leaders, but when it comes to actually putting hard dollars against it, it becomes a big challenge. So I think that that particular point on the CFO that you just made there is amazing. And then the third persona there, the operations side of it, we want to see processes put in place. We want to see that there is a solid short and long-term roadmap to bring in more processes that invoke the value of data in order to drive more efficiency on the operational side of the organization. So lead by example, put your money where your mouth is, and then take actual action with building processes. Louis, that was a really good part of the conversation, and I appreciate that insight there. I think it's really interesting. I want to shoot a few really quick questions at you to kind of wrap up our great conversation here, starting with technology. How much of a role should technology play in driving data literacy? You mentioned data catalogs, you mentioned business glossary. Is it critical? Is it the first step in the process? And are there any other bits of technology or software that you would recommend?
Becomes the table stakes at some point, okay? I won't say it needs to be the initial investment, but it definitely becomes the reference material that's going to be utilized going forward. And a large portion of what happens in building out these data organizations is you have to have good data governance, right? And that data governance aspect really comes down to ensuring that we're all singing from the same hymnal, we're speaking the same language, and that we have a referenceable place that we can go to find data, to know what its level of quality is, to understand the confidence level that it's maybe being used for today, and being able to have that reference documentation. It's almost like having a Wikipedia, kind of a environment where, hey, I got a question, I got to go, do some research. And this is where I would go to this referenceable area to really understand that. And so again, this goes back to the data literacy, the glossary, the catalog, however you want to refer to it, but really trying to understand the data, and with that, understanding the data about the data. And so even before hiring your first data scientist, it's not something that I think you need to do, but it's definitely something that's going to be questioned early on as to, where's the Wikipedia that I can go to find out whether this data is any good or whether I should even be using this.
I love the way that you defined and you positioned data governance before as very much a enablement function and process rather than a restrictive one. The world is changing to a place of, and it has to change to a place of saying, can I help you to understand the data that you're looking to work with, right? Rather than saying, have you been certified to use this data? That's really encouraging to hear seasoned data leaders like yourself positioning data governance in that space. Last question here. First of all, Louise, this has been incredible. Thank you. Thank you for all of this. Thank you for taking the time here. It really has been an absolute pleasure. In the last question that I asked you, you mentioned, would bringing in technology or having a data glossary be one of the first steps? There are some questions on whether it would or wouldn't be. But if you today were entering into a new business, or if you were coaching, consulting a data leader who was entering into a new company and they needed to start driving data literacy within the organization, the 3-4 tips, first actions, tips on what to look out for, tips on what to do. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I'll break it back down to my Six Sigma space and focus on, there's the people aspect, the process aspect, and the technology aspect. From an effort of really understanding the technology, there doesn't have to be a huge investment there, because what I would intend on doing is I would be bringing in potentially a couple of experts in the data engineering space, in the data science space. And my experience has shown me that in those spaces, at least right now, there's a high level of capability in the R and Python space. And so, from an open source aspect, there's not a lot of investment needed. Maybe there's a platform, maybe there's a processing capability, building out virtual machines, having data storage aspects. And again, those things are becoming cheaper and cheaper through cloud capabilities. So there doesn't have to be a lot of investment on the technology side on day one. Where I see the best opportunity for investment is in the people. And so bringing in the right data scientists, bringing in the right data engineers that understand the kind of data that you're dealing with in that industry is very important. And that's on the data engineering side. On the data science side, it's not as important because, again, they're primarily building models based on data elements that they bring together. It's great if you can find a data scientist who has industry knowledge, but more often than not, you're not going to. And so having somebody on the data engineering side, at least, that has some understanding of that data, and sometimes that person's already in-house. It's amazing if you go into the IT organization and you deal with the folks who have had exposure to the data warehouse and some of these data storage areas. Those folks, they've been with the company, 10, 15, 20 years. They really understand the data. They know what can be relied upon, what can't be relied upon. And so even growing somebody from your IT organization into a formalized data engineering space, that's a great opportunity and a great career path. The process side is really where the rubber meets the road, though, right? Being able to get the business and the data environment, right? Whether it's IT or whether you have the opportunity to build a new data organization, to get them to speak the same language around what it is that they're trying to solve for. So what is your business strategy? How does your business strategy connect to your data strategy? Build out that data strategy. And what does that look like, both short-term and long-term? And how do you go about putting that into operation, right? So good project management is really what it takes there on that process side. But those are the three main areas, and those would be the three main initiatives I would look at to kick off an effort like that.
So to summarize and get your thoughts on this, so technology doesn't require a huge amount of investment, but make sure that the other processes that you have or people that you're bringing on are supported by technology, but it probably doesn't need a huge amount of investment because there's quite a lot of open source or solutions that could be easily acquired and spun up with cloud technology today. From a people's perspective, make sure that you've got highly proficient data engineers who can deliver the right data, and then data who can use that data to get insight and drive the value from it. And then from a process perspective is really where the heart of the data literacy is. Bring all of those groups together with the business so that there is that unified language and that the question and answer process is as fluid as possible and understood by all the parties. Is that a decent summary of that?
Excellent.
Wonderful. Louis, I want to say again, this has been an incredible pleasure. Thank you for taking the time, and I hope to have you again on the show soon.
I really enjoyed it, John. Thank you so much.